Greetings, nationalists. Welcome to New Australian Bulletin. This might be the last interview we do on this YouTube channel. Tonight we have Nick Griffin. You know, if you don't know who he is by now, you don't deserve to be acknowledged. And we have the President of the Australia First Party, Dr. Jim Saleam. Now, we're going to discuss Gaza. That's right. That's right, YouTube moderators, Gaza. Now, the attack by members of the Al-Qassam brigades on November 7 happened with consummate ease that was celebrated around the Arab world and around the West by far-left supporters of the pro-Palestinian cause. But how could Israel not have known about these attacks? Insiders say that journalists from AP, Reuters, CNN, and the New York Times, according to the Jerusalem Post, certainly knew about it because they were allegedly embedded with Hamas at the time. Pretty far-fetched to believe that that could happen. It's far-fetched to believe that Mossad could not have known about it, given also that Hamas was a creation in part of Israel. So I'm going to throw this over to Nick. The 9/11 factor here. What do you? What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, I agree entirely with where you're coming from, but I'd say it's not so much 9/11. This is more Pearl Harbor. When the Japanese
that's a very good analogy.
But the Americans and the British intelligence, for that matter, knew perfectly well what was coming and allowed it to go ahead because they wanted to drive the people mad for war. So that's the first thing. Secondly, bear in mind, it's not only the Mossad, which apparently mysteriously missed this. Oh, no. It's also Shin Bet, which is their military intelligence, and all their network of spies within the Arab resistance, which they boasted about for years. But it's also, of course, you had to believe that the Five Eyes didn't see it. That Cheltenham, where the MI6 works out of, their enormous listening operation, which listens to everything, every communication all around the world, they didn't pick it up. The CIA didn't pick it up. You know, nobody did. When in fact we know that the little Egyptian intelligence service, they picked it up because the Egyptians warned the Israelis several weeks before that something big was happening. So obviously it's a fake. I'd say that the other thing that people who aren't sure should consider is this, and especially pro-Israeli people, when the Israelis are now saying, "Yep, we bombed that hospital specifically because we had intelligence that there was a senior Hamas operator there." So their intelligence now is good enough to spot something like that and justify the murder of 600 or 700 people in a hospital, but it wasn't good enough to spot this huge attack coming. It is obviously patently fake. They knew it was coming and they wanted it to happen because they wanted Netanyahu desperately needed this war. Bear in mind that just at the start of October, there was actually talk about a civil war among the Jews against Netanyahu. You had 300,000 army reservists on strike against Netanyahu. You had crowds of 1 million Jews in the street against Netanyahu. Netanyahu and his cronies desperately needed a war, and they needed a shock to get the Israeli people back on their side, and that's exactly why they allowed it to happen.
So, Jim, I'm going to get your take on it, and I might even ask you, do you think there was a likelihood that Israel actually had an agent embedded with Hamas at the time?
Look, I'd say to you that some of these things are almost inevitable, and I agree with what Nick has said. I'll go back to, I think it's September 7, 1 month before the Hamas events. Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, made a speech, and in this speech, for which he's been attacked all around the world, he said some unusual things about Israel and about Jewish people. And he rebrought forward, and he said that most of the people, the descendants of the Ashkenazim, are actually the Jewish people, 90% of Jewry, who actually descend from the conversion of the Turkic tribe, the Khazars. And he was attacked massively for this. He was called someone who couldn't be a partner. He was an anti-Semite. He also said some things that European anti-Semitism was partly a reaction to some economic power that Jews were considered to have had. And that, of course, meant that he ran foul of the historical industry that focuses very heavy on the Holocaust and so on. And they're basically saying that he's not a fit person to deal with. Well, if, for argument's sake, we know some of the stuff about the Khazars isn't quite right, it's a little bit right, but it's not part, it's a bit off track. But the fact that he said all of these things and he invalidated the Palestine Authority in the eyes of the West as a so-called partner towards a two-state solution. Now, this is a major blow. This was something that Netanyahu, I agree with Nick, it's something he needed. So already he's saying, I don't have a partner in the West Bank. It's these other people now over in Gaza who they call terrorists. And what happens? There's a terrorist attack upon Israel. So at this moment, there's no so-called partnership for peace as far as the official Israeli position is to be taken. And how you get one, well, it might take 10 years of massive financial build-up by Saudi Arabia and others to even create a bureaucracy in the Palestine territories to even get this so-called two-state solution. So I'd have to say that Netanyahu's first wish he got from Abbas, which was a freebie, and he said what he said, and he made it very clear he didn't accept the legitimacy of Israel at all. And the second one comes, I think, in the way that Nick said it. So I think we're dealing with a Pearl Harbor situation, I have to agree.
Well, what we have is a Islamic fundamentalist organisation versus an international arms dealer posing as a nation state. And neither cares for their people, but uses them as pawns. So when people are equating Hamas with the Palestinian people, I think that's an awful mistake to make. A history of Israel's dealings show very much that they're not averse to sacrificing their people when business or the state requires it. And indeed, reports suggest that innocents attacked on November 7th, who were overlooked by Hamas, were obligingly obliterated by the IDF.
One point I think that has to be said, there was a conference, a large Muslim and Arab world conference that was held in the last couple of days. And whatever's happened with this, like all clever things, Nick mentioned, I think that Hamas had Israeli input, how it was set up. It was a clever ruse, like all these clever ruses. The Germans sent Lenin to Petrograd. Our side gave money to Osama bin Laden, and now this brilliant plan comes up to create Hamas. But they've actually created a certain unity in the Arab and Muslim world that could never have happened otherwise. I think Nick said that in a recent post. And the second point is, too, the Arab and Muslim world does not believe anything that comes out of Israel or the United States, for that matter, at all about what's happening in Gaza. Now, even if we proved, or someone proved, that there is indeed a Hamas centre underneath a hospital, even if it's proved that the casualty lists are inflated, the Arab and Muslim world does not believe it, won't accept it. So this chasm has now been made. Maybe that's what Netanyahu wants. It possibly is. But the old saying, be very careful what you wish for.
Well, it's truth is always the first casualty of war. And I've noticed that with the footage coming out of supposed Palestinian hospitals. Some of that's just bullshit. They've just put a bit of grease paint on the kiddies and whatnot. I have heard, though, that there's a reason they do that, and that is to get it on the Western media, because you can't show sort of obliterated bodies and eviscerated corpses, so that is a strategy.
The white helmets did that in Syria.
Yeah.
White helmets.
But now, I do want to get to what you brought up, and that is the unification of the Arab world and just how deep Israel and America are getting into this. But first, I want to come to the West. And today, obviously, we all commemorated Remembrance Day. And we've seen in France, I believe in England, and down here in Australia, we've had cenotaphs, attacked and spray painted with pro-Palestinian, pro-Palestine messages. And this is a thing, and this is something that the Jewish lobby, which seems to be getting a lot fair support from the media over here, but it's a numbers game, and the Jewish lobby has created a rod for its own back, particularly in Europe where the Arab numbers are so great. I mean, in footage of a pro-Palestinian rally in London, a British cop was harassing patriots. And when they asked him why they're not going after them, he basically said, because there's too many of them. So how can this situation persist?
I think it's the one for Nick, that one.
Well, first of all, you're saying we've seen these attacks on cenotaphs. Well, we haven't in Britain. I've seen one. I've seen one actual photograph which shows or purports to show a vandalized, spray-painted war memorial, which I believe is a town in Lancashire. Now, that's possible. None of the others. We've had wall-to-wall stories in the gutter press in Britain in the last week of poppy sellers being jostled and attacked and so on. None of it is true. The Royal British Legion have said none of it is true. The police have said there was no attack. So we're dealing yet again with huge amounts of propaganda, which everybody should take with a pinch of salt. Now, there are certainly Islamists out there who are thoroughly capable of spray painting a war memorial. They're capable of blowing themselves up and killing lots of innocent people. But they do not represent many Muslims, although the longer the West carries this on, the more Muslims they are going to represent, and the more of them there will be. And this is the craziest thing of all this. It was mad enough for the West to be supporting Israel in the first place, going right back to before it was even created. It was mad enough. But to import millions of Muslims into our midst and then to give them genuine, real grievances, all the grievances about white racism, all the rest of it, or Paki bashing 50, 60 years ago, none of this is anything real. But when Muslims, they don't innately, they may be patriotic to their own country or have certain local feelings and so on, but fundamentally the thing that matters to Muslims is their world brotherhood with their Muslim brothers and sisters. That's it. So to bring people who have that mentality into the West and then basically declare war on them, and at the very least to support, arm and completely go along with people at war with them, it's utterly mad. So we'd already imported a future civil war, and at present our elites are, well, they've lit the fuse, haven't they?
I was quite intrigued by the fact that the Australian media is continually talking about the rise of anti-Semitism, they say, in Australia and in Europe. And they write this material that appears to suggest that there's some sort of native European movement that is expressing old tropes about Jews and recycling old anti-Semitic material. But when you read very carefully, it's absolutely obvious. They're not talking about Europeans doing this. They're talking about immigrants doing this. And therefore, that's the source of the new supposed anti-Semitism. I'd make a submission, Nick, I'm sure you know where I'm coming from with this, is that to equate what Hamas might believe about Jews, or some of the Islamists believe about Jews, there is no comparison between their philosophy and historical anti-Semitism. They're chalk and cheese. Anti-Semitism was a social movement, as you know, that arose in the 19th century that equated Jews with the certain processes of industrialisation, had a class basis, it had an odd rationale and so on. But now there's an attempt to suggest that anti-Semitism is simply people who hate Jews, and obviously for whatever reason Hamas does and wants to do individual Jews terrible harm or something like that. But it's not anti-Semitism. Where do you think maybe this conflation of the old European historical movement with certain movements about Islam, what's the establishment trying to do?
That's an interesting question. Perhaps you're thinking it too deeply, being a very clever man. That you're dealing with a people who've got a paranoid streak a yard wide down their collective back, first of all. So any sort of criticism for any reason, anything which doesn't go their way, and it's anti-Semitism. So why would they seek to differentiate? Why bother to differentiate? It's all against them. You know, that's it. So I think that it's different aspects of the same thing, and it's not our fault. It doesn't start. It didn't start with the Christians waking up one morning in medieval times thinking, "I know, we're going to hate Jews." It didn't start with the 19th century people thinking, "I know, this industrial revolution aspect is hurting us. I know, we'll blame the Jews." It didn't start with Hamas waking up one morning and thinking, you know, "Oh, it's raining today. It must be the Jews' fault." It didn't start with that at all. It starts with the fact that and this goes back beyond Zionism. A lot of people mealy-mouthed, "Oh, I condemn the Zionists, not the Jews." No, I'm sorry. You have to say this starts with a problem that the Jewish people have, that their religion, their Talmudism, is fundamentally based on racism and loathing and contempt of the other, and the idea that the other has to serve them, if not just to be wiped off the face of the earth. And that comes out amongst elements of these people in different ways, in different times. And whenever it comes out, the people who are the victims of this take against it in different times, in different ways. But that's the fundamental problem. This is not at root a Gentile problem. It's not a Christian problem. It's not a Palestinian problem. It's not a Muslim problem. This is a problem that comes from the Jewish elites, religious as well as political, because they hate the rest of us.
So you're actually saying, if we take this back to the Netanyahu argument, that you have a massive argument in Israel, say for argument's sake, amongst Jewish people over different political questions. You're actually dealing with a decided fraction of people who, perhaps for colloquial reasons, we might call the Zionist elite inside that fraction. And they're the ones pushing this particular agenda.
Absolutely.
And, I'm following it. Yeah.
And of course, that's not without taking into account the massive armaments industry that constitutes the largest part of Israel's exports, and its predilection for selling them to authoritarian regimes. But the question at Hamas, and people forget this, they put their people in between the inevitable response that this was going to create. So I don't see how they're much different to Israel in their use of their people as pawns.
I do. No, I don't go along with that at all. We very rarely disagree. But no, their people are being slowly strangled and butchered in that place. Their land has been occupied, and they are resisting militarily, which they're quite entitled to do. Now, there's no doubt that obviously they understood that there's going to be hell to pay. But and I know that there will have been obviously some people in that giant concentration camp who opposed Hamas. I mean, they control it for one reason, because among other things, they killed lots of their Fatah opposition. So these people are saints, and yes, they are Islamists, and there is a Muslim brotherhood element there as well. But I have no doubt that the scenes that you see of huge numbers of Gazan residents, whenever there's been an attack and they're pulling people out of the rubble and all the rest of it, and they're all there yelling defiance, that is how they feel. So my guess is that Hamas now have far more support in Gaza than they had 2 years ago. And it's not for us to say, "Oh, you shouldn't resist." Yeah, just accept the occupation of your country and the ongoing genocide of your people. Accept that, because if you don't, there's going to be trouble. Yeah.
There was an interesting comment from a Palestine Authority leader yesterday or the day before, when Israel had made it clear they were going to take over security in Gaza. And he said that the Palestine Authority does not intend to take authority in Gaza off Hamas by entering on top of an Israeli tank. And one way or another, whatever's occurred there, it's created a massive leadership vacuum in the Palestine fraternity. And therefore, whatever they resist, there's no defined and absolute leadership in the way in which they are resisting. Might you think perhaps that this might then become a cause célèbre of the entire Muslim world, of the entire Arab world? That it's
absolutely so. I mean, this, as we were saying before, there's clearly no doubt that there was an element at the very beginning. Hamas was, if not created, certainly encouraged and supported by the Zionist regime, definitely. But they've got form for this. They create, they've got the story of the Golem in the Prague ghetto. The rabbis, because the Jews are being attacked by the Gentiles around them, they create the Golem out of clay, and it deals with Gentiles. Then it runs amok. They lose control of it. And this has happened, and it's not just the Israelis. Obviously, the CIA created the Taliban. But the Taliban isn't now controlled by the CIA. If it was, it wouldn't have cut opium production in Afghanistan by 95% in the last year, would it? So they lose control of these golems, and they fiddle around with things. There's the law of unintended consequences applies to the Israelis just as much as everybody else, because they are not the evil geniuses who control the world. They just happen to be very evil, and they do things which are so very clever, but too clever by half. So they created this thing because it was a short-term expediency to split the Arabs and to hit Fatah and so on. And it's now gone off on a foray of its own. And Hamas have now made themselves the heroes of the Arab street. There's no doubt about it. And even they even make themselves the heroes of the Iranian street, and they're not even Arabs, and they're Shia rather than Sunni. And long term, perhaps, possibly, the most dangerous thing that will come out of all of this is that they've managed to ignite and unite the entire Muslim world against not just Israel, but potentially also against the West. And really, I couldn't blame them. But one day that might make it very, very difficult.
We're both cynical men. We're all cynical men here. And this concept of a unified Arab world sounds, plausible, but is it likely? Surely every group that gets involved with it is driven by their own self-interest.
Well, it's like you don't want to
so it very well be that Palestine becomes a prize manipulated for the interests of another, let's call it Arab state. Nick?
Nick.
Well, yeah, it's possible, and obviously, I think all elites throughout history, they have their ideological reason and so on, their religious reason, and no doubt they behave very often. They believe those very strongly. They believe this is what it's all about. But there's also, personal self-interest. Whether it's the Genghis Khan type, if we have lots of conquest, I'm going to have lots of DNA spread around the world, or whether it's the military-industrial complex giving them backhanders. Most elites, there's no saints out there. As you say, we're cynical men, and there's ugly and selfish motivations on the part of individuals, movements, organizations, and religions. So there's no saints out there. But will someone particularly exploit the Palestinian thing? Perhaps Saudi Arabia might try to, or whatever. Yeah, no doubt. But overall, what you're saying here is the Arabs, the Muslim world, being brought close or pushed closer together than it otherwise would have been by this monstrous folly and wickedness that in the end comes out of the West. And it won't last forever, but it's a factor that you have to talk about. And it's a factor that none of the people out there who are saying, oh, good on the Jews for killing the ragheads or whatever, none of them are considering that even if that was true, you know, that it's justified and so on, and Hamas did all this and everything else, and that Israel is a gallant little ally of ours, even if it was true, there's still a price to pay, and the price will be paid on the streets of Australia, on the streets of Britain and France, etc., etc. The price is quite likely to be paid in terrorist bloodshed. And yes, you know, yes, it'll be wrong, but our masters, our elites, will have bought it on their own people.
We will come to that, but I get this sense, like you particularly highlight supporters of Israel, but aren't they? I get the impression that they're the powerful vocal minority more than anything. They're being trumpeted through media, but they're also the usual gaggle of interested, military industrial complex stooges like Nikki Haley and the neocons. I mean, in a sense, the way it's going for America, and I hoped to wind up with this question, but it could be the last uniparty Zion neocon hurrah, which a lot of us nationalists are hoping it is. But to bring it back to the West, the justice of the Palestinian cause exists only if the world unanimously condemns imperialism in all its guises. If we return to the nearest point of ethnic and cultural reference, excluding where a nation did not exist. So let's say 100 years ago, Israel didn't exist. We could come to the unanimous agreement that the state of Israel has not existed. It was established unjustly, etc. But, we have a situation here. You have it in England. It's all throughout Europe where Arabs refute the ownership of our lands, which they have over the past few decades come to occupy, to rally and decry Israel occupying Palestine. None of these guys are going to stand up with us and rally against white replacement.
No. In fact, Turkey is a very good case of that. Erdogan has actually said something like that, that the birth rates of Muslims in Europe could actually make them a majority in Europe. Mm-hmm. I'd mention, though, that this new Arab unity or Islamic unity, if you look at the role that the United States has given to Turkey in the Ukraine war, Turkey's now taken an entirely new path because of the Israel question. And Erdogan is looking towards Central Asia, towards Turkic peoples, so on and so forth, as a way to revive a type of Ottoman or transcendent Ottoman identity. A lot will come out of this. We could argue that, as is being touted in the media, that Zelensky and the clique in Kiev are definitely a casualty of this. And if Turkey changes sides, and it appears on the surface that it sort of has, then a major prop for the US system in Ukraine is just taken away. So there's a lot that comes out of this. I mean, obviously, we're not necessarily crystal ball gazers. We don't have a magic deck of cards. We can't predict the future. But we're seeing a lot of the props. As Nick has said, you've got this trend towards Islamic unity that didn't exist before between Shia and Sunni Islam. You've also got trends that unite different types of Muslims. It's a different thing that's happening here. And it doesn't matter really what Israel does. Every bomb they drop helps to bring this to realisation. So is it a case that we've actually arrived at some sort of apocalyptic moment? That's a question I'd put to everyone here. And the second question is, what's the outcome likely to be on the ground for patriots and so-called country by country?
Well, shouldn't we primarily see that the great evil is America If Australia, if we broke all ties with that hideous land, then the cord to the Zionism would be cut.
Well, as you know, there used to be an old Soviet Union thing.
China called it its debts.
Yeah,
goes America,
about the dog, wagging the tail,
That's
a comment. Nick, you look like you want to.
Yeah, obviously there's an element. The Iranians especially used to talk, probably still do, I haven't seen it recently, about the little Satan and the great Satan. And to them, the little Satan is Israel and the great Satan is the United States, which of course isn't the American people. The American people, especially the people of the South, were among the first victims of Washington, Wall Street, etc. imperialism. But so we'll lump it together nevertheless as the USA. And I think that perhaps what's going on to an element here, it's not just what Israel's doing, or it's all about their agenda. It's also about the USA agenda. And the USA is in the process of losing its hegemonic position in the world for financial reasons. The fact that they picked this fight with Russia in Ukraine in an effort to prop it up, and that's just made things even worse because the Russians are now in the final stages of demilitarizing not just Ukraine but the whole of NATO. And it's increased American debt at an astronomical extent. Just last week, it came out that the interest on America's debt is now over $1 trillion every year, and the rate at which it's growing is, you see the graphs. America is in quite late stages of a financial crisis, a crash, which is going to take away from it the ability to be the policeman or the bully of the world. And everything else changes. Everything else is going to change around that. And part of this is about the Chinese and the Russian, in fact, most of the third world now, the whole giant land-based trade operation, the One Belt, One Road, and all the rest. And you can see ways in which what Netanyahu and so on are being allowed to do in Israel by America is not even it's not in their interests. It's not even in the interests of Eretz Israel. But you can read it as this is all about American finance capitalism having a last gasp effort to try to keep control of the world and using everybody, whether it's Ukrainian conscripts or Israeli conscripts, throwing everybody into this effort to buy a little bit more time for the greater United States, for the greater Wall Street.
I have to agree with that. Definitely. In fact, as you probably know, there's for the sake of the argument, there's a wild new theory going around about the conduct of the German Nazi economy in the 1930s, that it was actually bankrupt in 1939, and therefore, in a way, it pushed itself into war. And the people who've come up with this theory have then extended it to the USA and have said that ever since they defeated fascism, they've operated on the basis of continuous debt, continuous war. And the only way they can ever get by is they have to stick up whole countries. They have to rob whole countries and monetize their resources and keep trading against the future that somehow they're going to end up in control of all world assets, all world resources and everything. And the useless paper money and the useless debt suddenly got value. If that theory is correct, then what you just said, Nick, I think it's on the edge of financial apocalypticism. It's the crash that, to say it's an economic crash, it's a combinational crash. It's economic, it's military, it's everything all at once. And going to war on Israel's behalf, it could start anywhere. It started in Ukraine. They've now extended it to Israel. If it spreads to the Pacific Ocean on a three-front war, that's the end of them. And they're defeated before they even get their troops to the battlefield.
Well, just through that, you could ask what troops. They are having spent the last few years transifying the US military, driving out, making it very clear to white boys that they're not wanted in the
They are now.
High heels.
Yeah.
There's a juxtaposition now where some wags are taking US Army advertisements from 2018, which focus on Emma's story. She was brought up by two mothers. She was around powerful women. Fast forward to today, what do they got? A plane full of white boys from down south. And yet the reality is, because I nearly got in trouble on YouTube for lending my thoughts to the comment section of the US Army page, but it's just a stream of white people going, well, I feel that there's enough empowered white women to go and fight this.
Take our place.
So the internal calamity that the US is under already, is it as likely to implode that extra stress of thinking you can project a military that isn't really there? I understand that they're down to about 180,000. If that figure could be correct, that's the last one I seem to have gained. Let's just say they're significantly depleted in the in the sort of regular infantry stakes. And what about, we keep assuming that every Jew and Israelite is on board with this, but I don't think that can be quite true, because Bibi has enough detractors in Israel alone. Are we really hearing the true story out of Israel about the discontent there? I mean, as we know, a lot of these weirdo Orthodox Jews would prefer to live in Palestine until, the red heifer is born and, the Temple of Gold is once more, and the great Messiah, Ronald McDonald, or whoever he is, comes along. So does Israel even have, good enough soldierly on the ground there, entering into the worst conditions of war, which are urban combat, while they're hit from by drones from? And what about the likelihood of them getting entangled with Hezbollah and being drawn into Lebanon?
Yes, Nick, Hezbollah.
Yeah, well, bring these things together. You're quite right. The Israelis, I'm sure, could deal with Gaza. It'll be quite bloody, and they'll take some heavy casualties, but their people are wound up by the atrocity stories, so I think they go along with that. And there are demonstrations by the families of the missing and so on, and by leftist Jews against Netanyahu. They've been over the last week or so, no doubt about it. But generally, the Israelis will go along with that, and they can cope with that price they can pay. But Hezbollah kicked their asses in 2006 when there was only 5,000 Hezbollah. There's now 100,000. They're far, far better equipped, and they're far better trained. And that would be a really, really serious war, which the Israelis might be able to cope with, but it's basically going to be a peer war, and it's going to be really, really messy for them, which is why they are desperate to bring Hezbollah into the war, because if Hezbollah are in the war, America will be dragged into the war, and then the Israelis get what they want, which is America going to war against Iran. And you say that, you're quite right. There's the fact that they've now, just now, for the first time in years, produced this US Army recruitment video, which is all white men, on that plane and so on. And as you say, I saw the comment section as well on the US Army's Twitter feed and so on. It's just constant white men saying, well, no Hamas ever called me white trash. Basically, I'm not going. And so that's the default American position. That was the American position before the Lusitania was sunk in the First World War. It was the American default position before Pearl Harbor, because the American people may be naive and daft in some ways, but they are not stupid. And they don't want to go to war on behalf of other people all around the world. They had to be dragged to war. And I'll tell you how they're going to be dragged to war. That American fleet, which is now positioned, in fact, there's several of them, off the coast of Palestine in the Mediterranean or in the Gulf, they're not there to extend American power. They are there to be destroyed. They're sacrificial lambs, because the American establishment knows perfectly well that Hezbollah, let alone Iran, have got ship-killing missiles, which makes, especially those giant aircraft carriers, they're one big fuel tank and they are floating coffins. And they know that. And they'll happily sacrifice the American Navy in order to get to shock the American people into saying, hell yeah, I will fight. Let's roll up our sleeves. You know, Grandpappy did it, we'll do it again. That's the name of the game. That's what makes this conflict so very, very dangerous to all of us.
But if that happens, that creates the likelihood of civil war with your huge population of Arabs. I'll just call them generic because they're obviously not Palestinians, but the Arabs inside Europe. Because obviously, if the West went to war, which I guess I'm jumping ahead here, a question I should ask is what would Britain do in that?
Right, well, Britain will go along with it because our elite are completely in the pockets, not just of the Zionists, but also of American capitalism and the American system. So, of course, we'll go along with it. And again, I think they know this. I think this is one of the reasons that over the last, 4 or 5 years, there's been a desperate push by the whole elite in general, and particularly every single Jewish NGO in Europe, to import millions of young Muslims of fighting age into Europe. That's no accident. It's because they want trouble in Europe. Now, they would not want a combined Muslim stroke hardline nationalist revolution, which throws out the elites. They don't expect that. They expect Islamist terrorist bombs in every single European city, in every British city. They want that because they believe that they can control those people, keep them under, keep them down. They'll need some more repressive powers to do it. They'll need to paramilitarize their police force even more. So this is all things they want to do in any case, and they want to drive the people of America into a long-term fighting war frenzy. They've just got to sink some aircraft carriers. That's the easiest way. To do it to the Brits, the Germans, the French, all they need is half a dozen Hamas stroke ISIS bombs on the London Underground and in the Paris Metro and so on. It'll do the same thing. So they know there's going to be trouble, but they don't care about the trouble. Again, coming back, forgetting the Zionists in it, coming back to the interests of the United States of America, the only way that the USA can keep control, can keep its financial system going for very much longer, especially if the Chinese and the Russians also pushed together by the previous folly, almost now forgotten, Ukraine and all the rest of it, of the people running and ruining the West. The only way that the Americans can keep something like control, at least of Western Europe going, and also keep the dollar on top of pound sterling, on top of the euro and so on, is if Europe is wrecked. You bear in mind the target of Nord Stream, or the Nord Stream destruction by the United States or one of its allies, was never Russia. The target of the Nord Stream attack was Germany. The target of sanctions against Russia over Ukraine is not Russia. The target of those sanctions is Europe. They want to ruin Europe because it's only by ruining Europe that the United States relatively maintains a strong position. So they don't give a damn if this ends up in a civil war in Europe between the Muslims and all the rest. It's all grist to the mill, and the mill isn't only a strictly Zionist one.
I'd have to agree. Yeah. It's very much the same in Australia too. It's heading towards a situation of communal violence, and who knows where that would lead. Australia is a very compliant tool, of course, of anything that comes out of the USA, and the Australian political elites are very, very pro-Israel, always have been. They make it virtually a condition of membership, you could say, of being involved in elite politics. So we're on the same page.
Well, just in this neighbourhood, for instance, Jim and I were driving yesterday, and we're going past cars with Palestinian flags flying from them. There's propaganda posted up around here. This is where I live. It's heavily Arab, right? They occupy this territory. And you think, is this weird? I can look at footage of England. I can look at footage of, Europe, Germany, Denmark, and it's the same bloody story. I mean, how many of them are there, for crying out loud? Is the Middle East empty or something?
You think so?
It's too obvious to not mean something, isn't it? Now, Nick, our mate Tommy Robinson is active again. What's his brief? What have Mossad got him doing?
Oh, his brief undoubtedly is to try and cause a civil war in Britain. 5-6 years ago, he had a really serious effort with obscene cartoons of Muhammad. There was a really serious plan they were working on to send all the stupid, good-hearted, daft English patriots into Muslim ghettos with posters of Muhammad shagging goats. And he knew perfectly well that and he said the aim of this is to start a civil war, not to win a civil war, because there was no prior preparation. There were no containers of arms for the English resistance or anything like that. There wasn't even any training. There was nothing at all. The idea was to get people slaughtered, and they tried the same thing. That was the first time around. It didn't come off, that one. So they were trying that with the cenotaph the other day, when they were winding not just Tommy Robinson and co, but sections of the press. The Home Secretary, Soila Braverman, who's a Hindu, but her husband's a staunch Zionist. She's proud of her IDF family members, all the rest of it. She was in it as well. And they were blatantly lying that these Hamas supporters were going to march on the cenotaph and desecrate it, which would be a cause for war for basically every decent Brit, self included, if that was going to happen, if it was ever going to happen. But no, the organizers of not a Hamas march, but a Peace for Gaza, a ceasefire now march, which has some Hamas supporters on it and many people who aren't, and probably as many white leftists and liberals as Muslims anyway. Yeah. So that march was never going near the cenotaph. They would never, because these people are sophisticated. They're clever. They want to advance their cause. That they would not go and desecrate the cenotaph. It's a complete hoax. But Robinson and the people along with him, their hope was that this would drag so many angry working class whites into central London, and then their presence, they hope, would spark off so much fear/hatred amongst elements of the Muslims on that march that they break away and go off and fight them, and there'd be a huge ruck in central London, and cops would be badly injured, and it would be I described it on Twitter a few days ago. What they're after, this would be Britain's Burntollet moment. Burntollet Bridge was the place where hardline Protestants in 1969 attacked a leftist / Catholic civil rights march, and it sparked and it wasn't a particularly big thing. There was no one killed at Burntollet. It was a ruck in a country lane, was all there was, and people were throwing bricks and bottles and hitting each other with sticks. But within a few days of that, you had the whole of West Belfast up in flames as Protestants and Catholics each burnt out whole streets of their neighbours' houses. And that's what they were trying to do, and they're still trying to do. And it didn't come off on Sunday, but they'll be back, because that's what they want to see. And sooner or later, unfortunately, Britain is so unstable, they probably will get it.
I get the impression that Tommy Robinson's more of a glughead than a man in possession of. Oh, really? He just doesn't strike me as an erudite sort,
He's quite a cunning. He's quite a clever lad. He's a pretty good figurehead. He can be very articulate. He's well coached. He knows his orders. And they picked him right from the start and groomed him right from the start to do this job. But he is not a rocket scientist. He's not a strategist. He simply does what he is told. And they're telling him, they've been telling him for a long time, wind this up. He's now said, we're going to reform the English Defence League. And I don't know what date he's set, but he said, we're going to have a march in an important place. So the only question is whether it's Luton, where it started, which is a very heavily Muslim town, or whether it's Bradford, because that would be even more provocative. But he's going to be there, and they didn't get their communal violence near civil war the first time round. The second time round, they'll come back for a third and a fourth and a fifth and a sixth until, unfortunately, they get it.
Is he still in cahoots with that Paul Golding?
They weren't very closely together, but strangely enough, Golding was, with all those of us who know these people, we're very surprised. The Golding came out a few days ago and said, don't go to the cenotaph. No, don't go there. This is a trap. You shouldn't go. Now, Jada Franson, who knows Golding very well, just said it's because he's a complete bottle job. He wouldn't dare go there himself. He can't tell his supporters to go, but he doesn't go. So it's purely personal. She knows him better than I do, but I find that very hard to believe because there was no danger. There's no threat going along to somewhere like that with hundreds of your supporters, other than the fact you might get nicked and thrown in a prison cell for 48 hours. You know, what the hell? He could raise a lot of money on the back of that. So I don't know what's going on there. My suspicion is that Robinson's money comes exclusively from the Zionist foundations and so on, from his Zionist backers, and his hope for more money comes from them. Golding has played a much longer term game playing footsie with people in Russia, and if he hasn't already had money from them, there's his big hope to get money and support from Russia. And of course, Russia's position on Palestine and what's going on is very different from that of the Zionist foundations in the United States. So I think that Golding perhaps was simply hedging his bets, and he's got another iron in the fire. So as he always does, he was worrying about himself first and foremost, rather than his on-off alliance with the Tommy boy.
And also, it's all about the screw. Sorry, Jim.
No, I'm following all this the labyrinthine world. It's very interesting, and you have to have a Byzantine mind to follow it. I'm working on it.
What I found interesting talking to you tonight, Nick, is that my perception of the character of the rallies, pro-Palestine rallies in England, you're suggesting it's not what I'm perceiving, that there's a certain unruliness to a sort of anti-British sentiment coupled with the which would be understandable given, England established. It's right.
There is that feeling, and let's face it, you'd have to be pretty. We get the point that British imperialism and American imperialism are a bad thing. So obviously, you'd have to be a pretty stupid Palestinian supporter not to understand that this isn't just Israel. The West and Western powers are part of this. And let's face it, we pay the taxes that allow them to do this. Our people keep on voting for it. Even if we don't like it, we don't stop it. So collectively, it's not unreasonable for them to think, well, the people of the West generally are responsible for this. They all bear guilt for it. So for them to have hostility, so it wouldn't be unreasonable. But while there's elements who no doubt really hate us on that march, let's say lots of them are white liberals. Probably, if you want to look at anti-white hatred on that march, don't look at the Pakistanis, don't look at the Arabs, look at the whites who are on it. Look at the white liberals, look at the Socialist Workers' Party, which founded by Igor Gluckstein. Its key theorist now is a bloke called John Rose. So still from the same people. They're the ones who hate whites on that march, not the average Muslim who's gone along because they're horrified to see what's being done to their brothers and sisters in Gaza. What I can tell you also directly and personally is that once I started speaking out on this on Twitter, I'm wall to wall really with on my Twitter feed with Muslims saying, well, I was brought up hating and fearing you and so on, but now I've got to say you're the only man talking sense from your community and so on. And some of them saying, the grooming issue, we understand you being angry about that. So they're saying it's not Islam, it's a Pakistani thing, and we can talk about it more. And they're saying, and I've spoken to several on the phone, and they acknowledge, they understand that my people have genuine, serious and legitimate grievances, just as their people do. And they also see this potential civil war coming, and they don't want it either. And they would rather, I've said, what will happen if there's a civil war? We can't kick you out. There's too many of you, and you're not going to get rid of us. There's too many of us. There'll be a civil war, and initially you'll win because you've got far more young men. They're far fitter. They're more motivated. They've got faith. They're better armed. They'll kick the crap out of us for some time. You 2-3 million British dead. Then you'll have trouble because then the Brits will get their act together and they'll fight back. But however much they fight back, they'll not get rid of you, just as you won't get rid of us. And in 30 years' time, it'll just be like Burnt Tollet. There was a young Ian Paisley. Oh, yeah. And there was a young Morrison and Adams in the ghettos in West Belfast and so on. And they were all young firebrands, and they all wound it up. And 30 years later, after killing 3,000 people, which in British terms would be about 120,000, if allowing for population, after a civil war of that level, stage, and ferocity, the men who started it ended up as bestest pals, all on the government payroll, all sitting in big fancy banquets. Yeah, they did all right out of this. And what I've said to these Muslims, and the response is overwhelmingly positive, is that's where we're headed. At the end of a 30-year civil war, which nobody can win, people will sit down and they'll carve out some kind of uneasy peace deal. And what I'd rather do is to try to short circuit it and do that without having the 30 years of horror.
But again, as a nationalist, it just fills me with this impotent rage, right, to be put in this position when these people are all themselves interlopers, and we're here discussing Israel's occupation of Palestine, but they're occupying us. Can they not see the?
I think some of them do, but impotent rage is understandable, but there ain't any use to it. We are where we are, so potentially, and there's a peace deal. If you actually want to say, right, what we need is re-emigration, as it's now called, and perhaps it's accurate because repatriation means we're sending them back, which we can't do. It's not militarily, physically possible. Quite apart from the morality questions, forget it. It cannot be done. But re-emigration doesn't necessarily mean that they're being forced. It means they're going. So if you want re-emigration of the Arabs out of Australia, and I want re-emigration, it's not just about Muslims. There's huge numbers of black Africans. They're the biggest number now pouring into Europe. Some of them are Muslim. Most of them aren't. They're either theoretically Christian or they're animist. And so this is a problem as well. But you can't expect re-emigration to any country when Zionist military intervention and capitalist looting have turned those countries into basket cases. You can't expect it. So I think potentially there would be grounds, if you want to be a real idealist, there would be grounds for a global peace settlement, whereby we get out of the Muslim world, and because it's then a better place, and it would be because Afghanistan was a decent place by our standards, certainly before it was wrecked by the USA seeing a chance to deal with Russia over this. So once their countries became a better place, once the countries of Central Africa, which the French have been looting mercilessly and appallingly for their uranium money, once they're actually allowed to keep that uranium money, they could make those countries better places. And at that point, then re-emigration as part of an overall peace deal would become a possibility and a moral and a good thing to do. And plenty again of these Muslims, they say, do you really think that a lot of our people want to stay in this horrible, wet, cold, revolting climate? We're here because our world has been fouled up by you. So undo the fouling up, and then we can talk in terms of and hope that some of them would indeed go home. But why would they go home to a hellhole which our elites, for political or financial reasons, created in the first place?
I have to agree, and I'd say that one of the big changes that took place in the national movements, Nick, as you well know, is that they recognised at various points that some of the historical legacies of the old empires and all of this didn't actually do any good for us. And therefore, to abandon something that wasn't doing any good and come to a different conclusion about where the world's people stood became a much easier proposition. I'd have to agree with you about that. It's obviously right. It's the case of Australia. You might have heard just last week, there's an insane deal whereby Australia is taking on the population of a small country in the Pacific called Tuvalu. And they're allegedly the victims of climate change and they all migrate here. And there's a number of other islands. I said once in an article, what do these countries do? Keep their seats in the United Nations and run them out of a post box in Cairns, right? Maybe so, right? But there's no solutions like this. We have to have a different answer to the Pacific. We have to have a different policy. Australia once had a hideous thing during the imperial days. We imported slave labour here. We had it all over the cane fields and whatnot in northern Queensland. The working class fought that. They defeated that. There's the idea of racism and racial bigotry and all this sort of stuff. It's just not where we're coming from in the long term. It's nonsense. Has to be other solutions for the peoples. Perhaps I'll just finish and I'll shut up. If there's one good thing that comes out of this contention with Zionism, it may well be that moving into a semi-apocalyptic situation, I use that word very, very loosely. There are two visions. You can stick to the globalist vision or you can take the road of free peoples. And that's always been said in nationalist movements now for 40 to 50 years. Sorry, back to you for conclusion, I suppose, and host.
Yeah, part of the problem that an ordinary white nationalist has, sort of getting finally to this point, is feeling, well, when they're attacking British colonialism or white colonialism and so on, basically they're attacking us, one way or another. Yeah, at a certain level we understand that this thing was, wrong, that it's made a mess, but there's an element, well, if we're going to accept, this is us beating ourselves up. We're full of white guilt about white colonialism, and the way to deal with that is, I think, to understand that the first victims of the colonialism employed by the elites of places like Britain were not the Africans, not the Arabs. The first victims of that were us, because the reason that there's so many white Australians with English or British origins, of course, is that the whole thing starts off with the convict movement. And what were the convicts? The convicts were people who were forced basically to rebel against the Black Act, which created about 100 different offences for which you could be hanged, and even more for which you could be deported. And before British capitalism stole anyone's land abroad, they stole literally 1/3 of the land of England from the English people. And the same was done not just in the Scottish Highlands, but in the Scottish Lowlands. The same was done in Ireland. That's where the wealth started. It wasn't slavery over there that gave British capitalism its initial kickstart of capital accumulation. It was the theft of our lands, the suppression of our people, where it started. So the fight against global capitalism and the City of London, etc., it's not something we take up because we're guilt-ridden whites wanting to make amends for what we did to them. We should take it up because our struggle against our elite is the same struggle as the struggle of the third world against our elite.
Correct.
Well, as I wrap this thing up, and it's been quite a discussion. Zelensky, yesterday's man.
Who?
What's on the cards for him, mate? Is he going to bugger off to a Swiss chalet, or what's?
If he's very, very lucky, he'll get to bugger off to a Swiss chalet. He runs the serious risk of most dictators propped up by United States money. They very often end up just thrown away and hanging off a lamppost or something similar. But certainly, I don't know. Are you aware of Constantine Kissin in Australia?
I'm sorry?
He's Constantine Kissin. Have you come across him?
No,
He's a Russian Jew who in Britain he's been promoted. He's one of the great social media celebs and so on, pundits, and he's been for the last few years urging that Britain has to join the United States and keep on pouring money into Ukraine because this is an existential fight. If Putin isn't stopped there, there'll be Russians with snow on their boots trampling through Milton Keynes next week. That sort of thing. And Konstantin Kissin suddenly, bang, changed completely. No, basically the war's over. They've got to have a peace deal in Ukraine because, of course, Konstantin Kissin is not a Russian. He's a Russian Jew. And he's now saying all the West's effort has to go into helping Israel. And he stands as a cipher for the whole damn lot. They can't fight two wars at once. God only knows why they're trying to still provoke, well, they backed up a little bit in terms of provoking China into a war on Taiwan as well. They can't fight one war, let alone two, and certainly not three. So because let's face it, the Ukraine was only ever being used as a way of grinding down Russia, etc., and making money for the military-industrial complex. It's now utterly unimportant compared to maintaining the West's ability to help Israel in what it's doing. So the Ukraine thing, it's going to be settled one way or another, and the Ukrainians could have had a really good deal. They're now going to get a lousy deal. But that's what happens when you get on the wrong side of history.
I agree.
What are the chances of Zionism being crushed? I mean, we've discussed the unification of the Arab people, and I tell you, between Sunni and the Shia, putting aside, their historic religious differences, every nationalist lives for this.
Look, I'd have to say to you that I go back to something that Nick said before, that the solution to the question of Zionism must be an internal revolution amongst Jews themselves. They have to address this question. There is, fortunately or unfortunately, a Jewish question, and the Zionists are really that question. They were born in a hideous way. They adopted ideologies that Europe eventually went beyond. They tangled around religious doctrines and turned it into politics. They are a problem. They're real. They exist. They have nuclear weapons. They exist. And they are as mad as, if not madder than, some of the Islamists I would otherwise condemn. They are a problem. But the answer to them, you can certainly put Israel under quarantine and all the rest of it, but it has to come from within. It's the Jews who have to depose Zionism. And will they do so? Well, the world hopes that they do. But we're in a crazy period, as the Chinese say. We live in interesting times.
Any last words, gentlemen?
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. I think what you asked that question, will we see an end to Zionism? Zionism, obviously, it's specifically Jewish, but equally, it's the Jewish version of 19th century romantic European nationalism, and it's the Jewish version of 20th century European fascism. And it's also the Jewish version of 19th, 20th century European imperialism. It's all those things. And all those things in Europe have gone. They're the last European colonial fascism out there. So historically, I think it's likely that it will go as well. I think it won't last. It can't last. Demographically, it can't last. Yes, they breed faster than we do, but still they're not outbreeding the Muslims. End of. So it will go. The only question is whether it goes, as Jim says, in the end, basically a peaceful way, because the Jews or Jewish people themselves reform it. And there are Jews out there criticizing it. Some of the best criticism, the UN's review, for instance, I think is the best written source of truth about what's going on in the world, and in English in the entire planet, run by Ron Unz, who's a Jew. So there are Jews who are calling this out and so on. So either they get in the end to grips with this and they take this poison out of their people, or in all probability, they'll end up destroying the whole bloody world.
Thank you very much, Nick. Thank you very much, Jim.